tornado sirens going off, and you have that moment of panic. It's like, what do we do when there's a tornado, right? And then instinct starts to kick in. And then somewhere in the midst of the fear, you start to recognize, wait a minute, what do I really have to fear? I'm a child of God. It's going to be okay one way or another. And if it's not going to be okay, there's not much I can do about it, right? And then you relinquish a little bit of control, and you go about your morning, and there's a little bit of a peace that you carry because you're in God's hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. And one way or another, we're held and we're loved and suspended in that grace. Everybody got a card, correct? Okay, the text on the card, Jeremiah 17, but there's a precursor here. I want to read to you Psalm 30, which is a simple psalm. And it says, I will extol you, O Lord, for you have drawn me up and have not let my foes rejoice over me. O Lord, my God, I cried to you for help, and you have healed me. O Lord, you brought up my soul from Sheol. You've restored me to life from among those who go down to the pit. Sing praises to the Lord, O you saints, and give thanks to his holy name, for his anger is but a moment, and his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes in the morning. As for me, I said in my prosperity, I shall never be moved. By your favor, O Lord, you made my mountain stand strong. You hid your face. I was dismayed. To you, O Lord, I cry, and to the Lord I plead for mercy. What profit is there in my death if I go down to the pit? Will the dust praise you? Will it tell of your faithfulness? Hear, O Lord, and be merciful to me. O Lord, be my helper. You have turned for me my mourning into dancing. You have loosened my sackcloth and clothed me with gladness, and my glory may sing your praise and not be silent. O Lord, my God, I will give thanks to you forever. The Psalms are beautiful for a multitude of reasons. One, because they're so poetic, but they're a plea, a cry for mercy from God. And that's a piece that we forget sometimes. You ever been in a situation where you've been like completely at the mercy of somebody else? Like they get to decide your fate. It's a pretty humbling place to be. And time after time, the people of God find themselves in that position where there is nowhere else to turn except for to turn to God. And in that place, they cry to God. And here's the thing. God hears the cries of his people in all times, in all things. And there's a beauty to that. And so today, this Jeremiah text, 17th chapter. So Jeremiah is this really interesting book. If you haven't read Jeremiah, I would encourage you to find one of these somewhere in a drawer hidden away. Or maybe, rent a hotel room and there'll be one in the bedside. Just borrow it. Go to the library, check one out. Holler at me. I've got a bunch for you to borrow. Go online. Download the Bible app. Anybody else have any other ways that you could read this? I'm sure there's a multitude, right? But it's a book to read. So basically, Jeremiah is this prophet, but he's really a preacher, right? That's what he is. He's a preacher to the people of God. And God speaks to Jeremiah. And later in Jeremiah's life, after years and years, 30, 40 years of preaching, God tells Jeremiah, I want you to collect all your sermons. I want you to collect all of the times that you spoke to the people of God, and I want you to put it in writing. Like, can you imagine trying to compile your whole life of work in writing? To go back here and there. And so Jeremiah did what anyone would do. He assigned it to somebody else. And that gentleman, he's got a B name, I don't remember it, it's a strange name. He began to compile all of these things. And with it, he not just compiled the sermons and the words of Jeremiah, he also compiled all of these perspectives and thoughts from other people observing Jeremiah. And so the book of Jeremiah really reads as this like anthology, historical account of Jeremiah from the beginning to the end in his journey. And so it's split into two sections, really. There's a time before the exile, and there's a time after the exile. There's before the Babylonians and after the Babylonians. And chapter 17 really falls in that first section. And Jeremiah was sent for two purposes. First purpose was to be a prophet to Israel. Now that's pretty specific, right? You can understand that. Be a prophet to Israel, speak to Israel. But he was also called to be a prophet to the nations. And with that became this duality. On one hand, he was called to critique and almost chastise the way that the Israelites were living, the way that these people were choosing to live and turning their face away from God and idolizing all of these idols, idolizing every god except for the true God. And on the other hand, he was called to uplift and inspire, to tear down, but also to replant. And so, in chapter 17, we find an interesting dynamic. And I'll be honest with you. If you were to read chapter 17 in the most modern language with no historical context of Jeremiah and no real historical context of the United States of America, I have a feeling you might draw some parallels. Judah's sin is engraved with an iron tool, inscribed with a flint point on the tablets of their hearts and on the horns of their altars. Even their children remember their altars. Beside the spreading trees and on the high hills, and my mountain and the land and your wealth and all your treasures, I will give away as plunder together with your high places, because sin is throughout your country. Through your own fault, you will lose the inheritance I gave you. I will enslave you to your enemies in a land you do not know, for you have kindled my anger, and it will burn forever. This is what the Lord says. Cursed is the one who trusts in man, who draws strength from mere flesh, and whose heart turns away from the Lord. That person is like a bush in the wastelands. They will not see prosperity when it comes. They will dwell in the parched places of the desert, in the salt land where no one lives. But blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. They will be like a tree planted in the water that sends out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in the year of drought, and it never fails to bear fruit. The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? I, the Lord, search the heart and examine the mind to reward each person according to their conduct, according to their deeds deserve. Like a partridge that hatches eggs it did not lay, are those who gain riches by unjust means. When their lives are half gone, their riches will desert them, and in the end, they will prove to be fools. A glorious throne exalted from the beginning is the place of our sanctuary. Lord, you are the hope of Israel. All who forsake you will be put to shame. Those who turn away from you will be written in the dust, because they have forsaken the Lord, the spring of living water. Heal me, O Lord, and I will be healed. Save me, and I will be saved, for you are the one I praise. They keep saying to me, where is the word of the Lord? Let it now be fulfilled. I have not run away from being your shepherd. You know I have not desired the day of despair. What passes my lips is open before you. Do not be a terror to me. You are my refuge in the day of disaster. Let my persecutors be put to shame, but keep me from shame. Let them be terrified, but keep me from terror. Bring on them a day of disaster. Destroy them with double destruction. My friends, these are harsh words. And it's a God that is, for lack of a better word, frustrated. Raise your hand if you've ever been frustrated. Yeah. God's angry. And the reason is this phrase: Judah's sin is engraved with an iron tool, inscribed with a flint point on the tablets of their hearts. Now, to understand the context of that and how aggressive that is, at this point, whenever they were to write on tablets or stone, they would use a flint point that was so sharp that they would literally etch into the stone. And what Jeremiah is saying in this text is that the sin of the people in this reign of Judah was so much a part of who they were, was so much a part of their identity and the way that they walked through life, that it was literally etched into their hearts. Everything they did was a result of sin, was a byproduct of sin. So much so that their hearts were literally corrupted. I want you to think in a modern context. When we walk out of these doors, how easy it is to fall into a completely worldly context, completely absent of God. You know, there's places that you go and you drive down the street and here's a dispensary right here and here's a liquor store right here and so on and so on and so on. And how easy is it to fall into a life of destruction? How easy is it to turn our minds and our attention and our focus away from God and to get caught up with this all-consuming fire of ourselves, chasing pleasures, chasing our indulgence. And that's the reason why in this text, there's a contrary thought to what we say. You ever hear this phrase, follow your heart? You hear it all the time, right? Follow your heart. Please, Liam, follow your heart. Here's what Jeremiah says about this, coming directly from the Lord. The heart is deceitful above all things. Does it sound like you should follow your heart? And if you think about it, I want you to really think for a moment. Think about all the times that you had some maybe good intentions in your heart. But quickly, you got taken down a whole different detour. How quickly you can convince yourself that this is really a good idea, even when you know it's something that's wrong. How easily a little bitty fib turns into one great big lie. It's really easy. And when we lead with our heart, which is also leading by our emotions, we become reactionary, right? How many times have you had an emotion in the moment, right in this moment, and then 30 seconds later, a minute later, an hour later, a day later, you felt completely different? It happens all the time, right? Now imagine if you were to make a decision based on what you felt in that moment and to make all your decisions based on what you feel in the moment. You'd be all over the place because you have no time to process. Because you're leading with your heart instead of your mind and your spirit, and you're not being connected with God. And so in addition to having these corrupted hearts, these reactionary hearts, they begin to worship everything except for God. They begin to worship all these other gods. There was literally a temple, and they'd go inside and worship God inside the temple, and then directly outside the temple, they'd be worshiping other gods. And Jeremiah equates idolatry, worshiping of idols, to adultery in this book. Literally cheating on God with the way that we worship everything. And so in this chapter, we hear about the worship of man, but what are some other things we worship? Throw them out there. What other things do we worship besides people? Money. How many times have you sat and lusted after money? We've all been there, right? Especially when you need it. You know, I heard a story about this comedian, Damon Wayans. He was talking about how when he was a kid, they were so poor that he stole 15 cents from his dad. And his dad found out. He knew. He knew. Imagine being so poor that 15 cents, a dime and a nickel, means something to you. And in that place, it's hard not to lust after money, right? Because you need it. You need it. And you want it so bad because you don't want to struggle. And so it's natural. We lust after money. And we put people in positions of power and we idolize them and we put these characteristics on people as though they're not people. What are other things that we worship? What about these things right here? Yeah. You ever try to go a couple of days without picking one up? It's kind of hard. There's a worship in that, right? What about if you were to eat chicken and broccoli every single day? For every single meal, you wouldn't like it very much. We worship the food that we eat. Certainly, we want to enjoy it. Absolutely. There's so many things that we idolize and worship in our lives. But there's really only supposed to be one thing, right? Just God. And so Jeremiah steps back from this context where we live in this world that is broken. And believe me, my friends, that world out there that we live in every day, that we work in, that we travel through, is broken. It's absolutely broken. And Jeremiah turns away from that. And he says, "Heal me, Lord, and I will be healed." Now, just in that phrase, Jeremiah acknowledges a brokenness that, frankly, we don't. I want you to think to yourself the last time you acknowledged to God, hey, there's some stuff that's happening in here that is just instinct, that is just habit, that is just unconscious movement. There's a brokenness that's happening that's making me have these reflexes to my emotions, that's making me lust after things that I shouldn't lust after, that's making me lean into my human desires instead of leaning on you. But we don't do that. We don't surrender that to God. We pretend to have it all together because it looks better out here. We pretend to have it together because it's harder to have that conversation with God than it is to pretend like, you know what, I'm good. But we are broken. It's natural to be broken. It's part of the human condition. And the first step in that place is to acknowledge it, and that's what Jeremiah does. Heal me, O Lord, and I will be healed. Save me, and I will be saved, for you are the one that I praise. And Jeremiah says, I'm never going to run away from you being my shepherd. I see a lot of convenient outs. I see a lot of detours that I can take for immediate gratification, for temporary pleasure, but I'm going to take the long route. I'm going to choose the route less traveled. I'm going to do the hard work, and I'm going to trust you, even though everyone around me is saying, God ever going to show up? God ever going to do all these awesome things that you talk about? Even with the knowledge that we're going to be in exile for 70 years, I'm still going to trust you, God, to heal me, restore me, and ultimately to save me. And that's the call, my friends. In order to be healed, there's things that we have to do. So I want you to pick up your little yellow card here. And what does the H in healed stand for? You can't be healed without having some humility. And that's a really hard place to start, because our ego trips us up from ever acknowledging that we need some work. How do I lay down that ego? How do I surrender myself to God and allow that work to begin? And what's the E stand for? It's a hard word. How do I open up my heart that I begin to see the face of God in everyone that I encounter along the way? Because once we acknowledge the brokenness of our spirit, we begin to see brokenness in other people. And suddenly that person that you really disliked the person that you felt was mean, the person that you felt didn't care about anybody else, you begin to see the brokenness inside of them. You begin to relate to them. You begin to have empathy for them and understand that we are all in the same boat, all in need of the grace of God. And what does the A stand for? What is my spiritual posture? We've talked about it over and over and over again in this season. Posture, posture, posture. I even find myself sitting up a little bit straighter every time I say it. But it's important. How do I carry myself? What is my attitude? Aptitude, which is our ability to do things, only goes so far. Our attitude matters. Are we open? Are we receiving? Do we have energy towards the growth that needs to happen? Or are we just like, this again? It matters. And what does the L stand for? Are we conditional with our love? What are those conditions? And are they standing in the way of us giving love and thus ultimately receiving love? And what does the second E stand for? Even in the midst of the chaos of this life, even in the midst of brokenness, even in the midst of a desperate plea for healing, we still have to carve out space to praise. We still have to carve out space to exalt the God that walks before us. Because without God, what are we? And what's the D stand for? My friends, this is the hardest word in all of Christian faith. Discernment. How do I hear the voice of God speak? Do I just show up and sit in a pew and listen to that guy stand in the pulpit and say words and we move on and we sing songs and then we go about our lives? Or do we actually grab on to the voice of God that speaks through the chaos and pull something out that we can tangibly hold in our hands and carry with us? When we read the text and we listen to Nancy or Timothy read the text, or Glenn read the text, do we just hear words and names that we're glad we don't have to pronounce? Or do we pull something out and hold it in our hand and say, this is what I'm going to carry with me? That, my friends, is discernment. God is speaking and has been speaking and always will be speaking. The question is, are you listening? Jeremiah writes this text thousands of years ago. It wasn't like 20 years ago and we're just cycling back around. But it's just as relevant right now in this moment as it was when he wrote those words. And what does that say about us as a people? We could pull some really negative things, probably. But what it says is something about the human condition, that we do this. It's part of who we are. But while everyone else was zigging, Jesus did something else, didn't he? He zagged. And his life didn't look like this. It was much more chaotic than that. It was maybe something like that infinity symbol. And we get to choose where we decide to jump off this train that we've been on. We get to choose whether we want to jump off the hamster wheel or whether we want to keep going in the same circle. Whether we want to write these stories in 1,000 years from now or we want to write something different. And that's up to us. But in order for that to happen, we have to acknowledge the brokenness in us and we have to heal, to truly, earnestly heal. So if you'll turn the paper over there. On your index card, I invite you to spend some time thinking about these questions. Where do you need to be healed? Tangibly identify what is broken in your spirit. And what's still standing in the way of that healing? Why am I still in this place? Why am I treading water? Why am I standing still? What do I have to move out of the way so that I can begin that journey towards healing and ultimately towards being reborn again?
These are your talks, Tatum. This is the hope of God set free. These are your talks, it's here.